Good morning, everyone. It's so good to see you again. Good morning, Yamir and Anas. It's so great to see you guys. I'm so glad everyone is able to be with us today. We're starting this morning a little different. Professor Christine is finishing up a wonderful celebration of her recent graduates at the Institute. And we're so glad that she's able to be there with them today and celebrate another class of amazing academics joining the field. So we're wishing her well for the first few minutes of the webinar today, and she'll join us in just a minute to begin her talk. For now, Zaidan and I will get started with the introductory remarks. Warm welcome to everyone. Again, we're so glad you all are here. As we begin today, the Shingal Lives team wants to acknowledge that with the intense heat, the continued and intensifying political uncertainty, and the absence of basic services that many families in the Shingal and wider Iraq region are facing today, we're really honored that you chose to be with us here in a webinar. We're so proud to work as a team on all the aspects of Yazidi culture that make it so persistent and strong. We're so proud to be focusing on all the tools that have helped and are helping the Yazidi community resist even the harshest of pressures. Today, as you can tell, we're delivering our introductory remarks in English, pasting the Kurmanji language translation into the chat on Zoom and into the comments on the YouTube channel. As I acknowledged earlier, Professor Christine will play two roles today as both a project director for Shingal Lives and our speaker. She'll deliver her talk in English, and our amazing, inimitable, persistent Zaidan will offer live Kurmanji translation of her remarks. Mr. Zaidan, when you're ready. Translation of her remarks.
I'm sorry, I'm just unable
Mr.
to
Zaidan, when you're ready. Yeah. Zaidan, I think if you just mute that.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm just unable to paste them in the YouTube chat. I'm not sure why. On my computer. Okay.
I will pull that
but
up.
I can do it.
No, I'll pull that up and
I'm sorry,
it is all right. So guys, all those on the YouTube channel, I will be catching up on pasting the Kurmanji language translation into that chat. It will take just a minute for the translation in the chat to catch up, but it will be there.
Okay. So welcome everyone. My name is Edam Khaled. I am a writer, translator, and the field director of Shingal Lives. I grew up with these oral traditions in a family of farmers, listening to my grandmother, whose stories preserved and the retelling forgotten, if not told, the sad equation of memory. After my grandmother's death, those stories fell silent in our house. Generations and I had been Arabized through school and state-run TV until I began to my quest to find my grandmother's stories and songs. I had no idea that her stories and songs were my people's and at great risk of loss. A few years ago, I met Maria and Christine, who have ever since been dear friends and collaborators. We partnered to develop, organize, and facilitate this project, hiring an entirely Êzidi staff who then trained as oral historians, created an archive of our own for the first time, organized a festival of our own, and now here participating in a series of talks that will deepen the engagement between the Êzidi community and international scholars and bring our community-driven archive to the attention of both the public Êzidis as well as the scholars community.
Zaidan, if you want to keep pasting your remarks you just delivered now into the chat, you can see
Yes.
in our script for today where I have stopped. It's Êzidi Trudora. Shingal Lives as a project was possible precisely because we had such amazing and capable partners in both Zaidan and his colleague Ahmad Bashar, two poets and translators who are deeply connected to their people's oral traditions and literatures. Just not only terrifically talented poets, but terrifically committed people. They put together a team of 10 emerging oral historians, all of whom are here with us today, and all of whom are equally hardworking and dedicated. The archive that we're launching was gathered and put together by the team of oral historians we have here today. And I have consistently just been stunned and amazed at the conditions that these oral historians have produced work in. Very proud of them. My name is Marie Labrosse. I am a poet, translator, professor, and the founding director of Kashkul, the Center for Arts and Culture at the American University of Iraq, Slemani. Kashkul holds one of the largest databases for oral history in the Middle East, having made a commitment to significant oral history projects in Slemani, Mosul, and now Shingal. Shingal Lives is an oral history project, as we've mentioned already, led by a team of 12 Yazidi cultural preservationists to explore the endangered oral traditions of the Êzidi community in Shingal and their ecosystem, seen through the lives of storytellers, singers, and audience members. Toto Archive is our handle on Instagram, and also part of how we're releasing our community-driven, memory-based archive of Indigenous knowledge, created to curate the life histories of storytellers, singers, and audience members. We're celebrating their lives and histories at the Toto Festival that we held on April 29th at Lalish. And Shingal Lives isn't just about preservation, but also about exchanging knowledge. The Toto Archive is a collection of Indigenous knowledge collected by and for Yazidis, but also available to others. These seminars are our effort to put international scholars in conversation with the team who created the archive, as well as other Yazidi listeners. These seminars don't offer foreign knowledge as the only knowledge, but aim to continue deepening the engagement of the Êzidi community with foreign researchers who already work closely with their Êzidi research partners. The Shingal Live staff does try to embody a balance between outsider and insider perspectives. We did invite two fantastic researchers from within the Êzidi community who hold university posts to be part of these seminars, but for political reasons, for their own safety, they did not feel they could participate. Obviously, with our commitment to the rising generation of Yazidi oral historians, that is an injustice within this field of research that our team hopes to be a part of changing in the short term as well as the long term. A quick note on today's form. Christine will talk for about 20 minutes, 15 to 20 minutes about her work on the orphan generation in Soviet Armenia. Zaidan will be translating everything she says into Kurmanji. We anticipate the total of those remarks and their translation to be about 35 to 40 minutes, and then we'll host a Q&A. With the translation of Christine's talk, the seminar will move a bit slower. We think it's really important that both languages are heard and that Christine's talk is available to as many people as possible. Also, the translation process can give us time to reflect on the points made and hopefully lead to a more enriching discussion.
So I would be, I'm translating for Professor Christine today, which means that I, as a translator, will be faithful to what she says. And that doesn't mean that I or anyone else on the Shinga Lives project necessarily agrees with everything she says, but we value the senses in our own team as well.
Professor Christine, and again, we're just going to continue on introducing her, and if need be, she's given us a copy of her talk today so that I can begin her remarks if we need to. But Professor Christine Robbins is the Professor of Folklore and Intangible Heritage of Southwest Asia and the Middle East at the University of Exeter. She has been researching Yazidi culture and history for just shy of 30 years now. Given recent catastrophic events, she's focused her research on cultural survival and preservation, looking specifically at how certain generations have responded to global and local disruptive events. Christine measures her success as an academic not only in research and publication, but through the growth and successes of the community she studies, an attitude that creates such strength as the Shinga Lives project is testament to. Today, Christine will be telling us about one of these amazingly resilient generations, the orphan generation that emerged in Soviet Armenia, and what lessons we can learn from that generation about reviving culture after genocide. So, Zidane, if you feel comfortable, I think we can begin delivering some of this talk for Christine. If you're ready to begin,
delivering some of the talk.
Yeah, I can deliver it in English so that you don't have to be switching back and forth in your mind.
Okay.
So I may skip over the parts where Christine thanks Êzidi and I, but she definitely thanks all of you for being here today. She lets you know that this talk is taken from a recent book chapter that she wrote before the Shinga Lives project began, with one or two points taken from working with this inspirational project team. She has taken a lot of these details from her article. She's taken a lot of the details from her article out, but is very willing to cover some of those details during the Q&A section as they're relevant.
بری همو بخير هاتنا وهمات كن و ممنون برگهداریا و هموكا اف گوتارا كريستين ايرو اج وكا بشك كتابك نويك و اوكارت كالسر شن سال اوكارت كالسر و اف شابتر بري بروجاشن قال ليفز استي بكا وين بيسيبو مود بيجي قال قال تشتات الويت شابتر ده هكا نقاري قال همود تشتبكا البي كوتاري ده لبا بشتي السيشن قال ليفز جي كارغري ببروجي جي يعني چند نرين دوي زيادة تركرن السربي كوتاري وكارغري مع سربي كوتاري.
As you all know from our introduction today, Christine studies the history and culture of the Êzidis, especially the oral tradition, and she's been doing so for quite a long time. So when the genocide of 2014 happened, she thought a lot about the genocide that had happened 100 years before, from 1915 to 1918, and how the Êzidi community of Kars, Wan, and Bayazid had survived that by going to Armenia.
وكهون زانن كريستين السر يعني بقولينه أبونا دور 6 سال السر چاند و جواغا ازدید و دیروکا آخر کی ازدی بتایبتی دیرۆکە دەفکی و ئەدەبیاتە دەفکە خەڵکی ئێزدی و پشتی جێنۆسایدا ئاساڵە 2014 ئەو چوو بە جێنۆسایدەکە دیفەکری گوبەری 100 سالی بوو و بسەری خەڵکی ئێزدی دەهات جێنۆسایدە ساڵە 1915 هەتا 1918 و چاوا ئێزدیت قارس و قارسێ وانێ و بایەزیدە ji wê fermanê xelas bûbûn û çûbûne Ermînî û çawa şanda xwe parastin piştî wê fermanê li nav xelkê Ermîniya de Ermîniya Sovyêtî a berê.
And here is the woman of the hour, and I will transition over to her. Christine, I was just about to make a joke about how intelligent I would sound because I was reading this amazing talk that I had absolutely nothing to do with. So Christine, we'll turn it over to you, and we're so grateful you could be with us here today, and really grateful that you're ushering in a new generation of scholars where you are today. That's really special that we get to be a part of that in some small way. So Christine, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Christine.
Thank you so much, and thank you everybody for your patience. We had a graduation ceremony that overran, so thank you so much for starting my presentation. Êzidi culture survived not only that Ferman from 1915 to 1918, but it also survived 70 years of living in the atheist Soviet Union. So what are the lessons that we can learn from that history?
چاندا ئێزدی نەبتنێژ وێ فەرمانێ ساڵە 1915 تا 1918 خەلاس بوو لێبا چەند الدهێت سالارە دەرباس بوو وەکە جڤاگەکە ئۆلی لە ینی لە دەولەتەکە ئەوەکە یەکەتیا سۆڤیەتە بەری دەولەتەکە ئەملحد.
This is a subject that has some points in common with Dr. Maria Six-Hohenbalken's talk of 3 weeks ago about how Êzidi women in Armenia still tell about those terrible events, and also with Dr. Esther Späth's talk last week when she mentioned the revival of some religious practices after the Shingal genocide.
ئەف گۆتار ینی چەند تشتێ هەبەش هەیە چەند تشتی مەقال کری لە سەمینارت خۆیت بۆریدە وەک سەمینارە دکتۆر ماریا سێکس-هۆهنبالکن بەری 3 هەفتە و چاوە ژنێت ئێزدی ئەرمێنیا هەتانها وان ینی وان تشتال بیرا خۆتینن و بەیبا دکتۆر ئەستەر شپێتشی هەفتیا بۆری لەسەر چاوە هەنێک ڕێوڕسمێت ئۆلی هاتنە ئەڤەژاندن پشتی جێنۆسایدا 2014.
I've also noticed that much of the academic work and journalistic reporting about Êzidis talks about the many ferman against them over centuries and about the pain and trauma that they have suffered. These things are very real and they should be studied. But history also shows us constant examples of Êzidi resistance to attacks and oppression.
بەگەلێکی قالە بێ کارێ ڕۆژنامەیی و وانجی سەر ئێزیارە کرد پشتی فەرمانێ و چاوە بێ ئێش و ئازار و تراما کە گەشتی خەڵکی ئێزدی ژبان فەرمانێ هەفتوو دوو هەف بەجا ئەفتش جێ هەمووش دلن و لازم خوندن سەر هەمووکە بێ ئەکرن دیرۆکژی ژمارەت بیژێ کە ئێزدی جڤاگە ئێزدی هەردەم لەبەر خۆشیدایە سەرڕێی به زور دستی و بندستی.
The Ottoman Yazidis were great fighters. They resisted attempts by the Ottoman government to persuade them to live differently, to convert, to serve in the army, and to pay taxes. The Yazidis enlisted the help of foreign diplomats. They practiced everyday resistance, and they stuck persistently to their culture and identity. Echoing a scholar called Weitzman, we can speak of cultural resistance and cultural persistence.
و ازدی دولت عثمانی جی گله که يعني شروان جهادی بون که البر خود دان روش بروش و البر خود دان ج ایریشت دولت عثمانی و چاوا دویان جیانان بهرین چاوا دویان اولدوان بگهرین و هر فرما ازورداری السروان خدين و ازديا هر چونه با دیپلماتت الغریب جی اش دربی دا و روش بروش البرخودان دا چاند و ناس نمید خواه يعني بپاريزن و ام ایرو قالا آچندش به برخودانا آچاندی لنار ازدیاده بکن.
I'm speaking about Êzidi culture here, not Yazidi religion. I think it can be hard, especially for outsiders, to say where religion stops and culture starts, because Êzidi religion is a very practical one with rules about how to live.
از جاز ایرو قالا چاندا ازدی بکن نه اولا ازدی لبا گله که جب زحمتا تایبت جه غریبه گیره بیجه الکی داره اول و چاند جه خود بن تایبت ناف ازدیاده که ریو رسمی دوانت اولی بشک جیانوان روژانه.
So, if we are thinking about how to revive Êzidi culture or help it survive after genocide, we should be looking at how it has survived so many Ferman for so long, which means we are looking at the great strengths of Yazidi culture, Êzdiati. We're looking at why has Êzdiati, Yazidi culture, survived for so long and how. Our very own Mamosta Edam put it really well a few weeks ago in another context. He said, many Yazidis lived to keep their religion and culture alive, not to make money or do business, just to transmit what they were told.
وبجي هكا مبدي ام جاركتي يعني چاندا ازدی واجینن بوی ام پشتی فرمانه 2014 تایبت بوی ام الوان تشتا بگرین کو ازدیا بخوا بکار آنین دا چاندا خوا بپاريزن پشتی هفچند فرمانه هکا بسر خلقی ازدی ده هاتن و چاوا ازدیاتیا خوا بپاريزن پشتی هفچند زحمتی و زورداریه و تشتك يعني مقودي هذا بيرا بستين بيجيشلو قالك ازدي تايبت افجي روك بيج و ستران بيج كومجي ربالي نوها قود بو ابتني اش پاراستنا اچاندا خور يعني جيانا خود در باستگر نه شکارکی دیر.
So, as a folklorist, which is a kind of anthropologist, I'm interested in this question. Why do Êzidis feel this identity so strongly that many have accepted death rather than to lose it? And how are these close connections made with family and community and ancestors to support such a strong identity?
جواك فلكلور ناسكي و أوجي أنثروبولوج وكا بچند يعني شێوازە بژێ ئەس مەرەقدارە ئاوان پرسیارە ئێمە چاوە ئێزدیا یعنی چاندەخوا پاراستنە و ناسنامەیە خوا پاراستنە و دەرنەداینە هەتا وەختێ کوشتناوانژی بەرامبەری ئیش دەستدانە چاند و ناسنامەیان خوا بوو وان مرن و کوشتن یعنی شخۆڕە هەلبژارتیە گوهارتنە ناسنامەیان خوا و چاوە وان هەستێت بهێز هێزدار یعنی بە جڤاکە خۆبە و بە ناسنامەیە خۆبە گریە کە خەلکی ئێزدی خۆپێک بە گرێ بدن.
And this is actually a really enjoyable subject to think about, because instead of just talking about violence and grief and pain, we are also talking about love and caring and pride. I'm interested in the ways of speaking and behaving that Êzidis exhibit towards other Êzidis, past and present.
و بژێ ڕاستیژی ئەس خۆشیەکێژی ئەلڤێ مژارێ دەبینم خۆشیەکە بە کۆلینێ ژبەر ژدا لە هەکەم دیم قالە ئاتەعدەیە و زلم و زۆرداریە بکەن و ئێش و ترامای ئەم کارن قالە خۆشتەویە و مەرەقداریە و سەربلندیە vê banrêkê û rêbazê heke êzdiya pîşanda xwe parastî û çawa dîm li nav yanî civaka êzdî de ev rêbaz parastî û amade bûn ji berê û heta nihadî.
Now, of course, all human communities have got families and ancestors, but Êzidis do have some special features here. They have the Saduhed, which means the division of the community into sheikhs, pirs, and murid groups who don't intermarry. Each person has specific relationships and duties and special ways of behaving towards their own sheikhs and pirs. And there are also other kinds of religious relationships. The Penjfers, which brings in other figures such as Murabbi and Rahbar, and these are practiced more in some regions than others.
بێگومان ینی ئەف دامستاندن و گرێدان لەناو هەموو جواکێ دنیایدا هەیە بە باب و کارە دوانڕە و بە بەریە دوانڕە لە ناو ئێزدیادە هەنێکێ جداژیکە و چەند فیچەر خۆیات بن وەکە حەدوسەدا ku شێخ و پیر و مرید ژێک جداکردن ku ژێک نەزەوجن و هەر کەسێکی ینی گرێدانت وی و دانوستاندنێت وان جداینە بشێخ و پیرارە و بخەلکێ دیێر و ژبان گرێدان و دانوستاندنێت ئۆلیە دیتر و کەمژێرە چون تەبەقە ئەو پێنج فەرز هەنێک گروپێ دیژی هەینە ku ژێرە دیژن مرەبی و ڕەهبەر.
Êzidis are educated by their families in appropriate ways of behaving from childhood, like all human children, but they have a lot of complicated repertoires to learn. Because although outsiders like me don't really understand the meanings of certain words and behaviors, other Êzidis read these very clearly. It's a bit like when Dr. Maria talked about hidden scripts, that is, small words and gestures that mean a lot, whether it's in a song or it's in ordinary talk.
بجێ ئێزدیا هەر دیم وەکە هەر جڤاکەکێ زارود خۆشی فێری گەلێک تشتاتکردن هینی گەلێک تشتاتکردن وەکە چاوە معاملەت لێ خەڵکی دیێرە بکەن و چاوە ڕێزێل خەڵکی دی بگرن و هەربان تشتێت هەکە خەڵک هەموو یعنی وەکە بشرێتی هەموو پێ چاوە خەڵک زارۆتخوا هین بکە لێ با ڕێبازت هەنەکێ بزەحمەتتر بش ڕێبازت خەڵکی دی ژبەر یعنی غەریبش دەربەی جوپاکە ئێزدی وەکە مە وەکە کریستین بژێ نەکارن هەتا تەمامی یعنی واتەیە بان سلوک و پەیڤە ئێت خەلکی ئێزدی یعنی تێ بگەهن تەمامی و دژێ بیرامژی تێ کە دکتۆر ماریە سێکسۆهن بالکن قالە یعنی پەیڤێت بە شارتی کرد یا قەولێت بە شارتی و چاوە ئەفتشت خۆیاد بن لە ستران و یعنی پەیڤاوانە ڕۆژانە.
All this means that there is a really rich web of connection and social behaviour within Êzidi communities and a very strong insider-outsider dynamic.
و ئەف هەمووش مەڕەخۆیات کە و تەڤنەکە ئەگرێدابوونێ و دانوستاندنێ تەبنەکە دانوستاندنێ ئەگەلەکێ هێزدار ناو ئێزدیا ناو جڤاکێت ئێزدیدە هەبوو کو هەمووکە دێگرە هەڤشت کرد.
And the connections are very strong with the generations that have gone before as well, through the oral traditions. There are lots of forms. There are historical stran, which make people feel strong emotions, sadness or empathy or aesthetic pleasure. There's the folk tales that you hear in your mother's arms when you're small, which might have some scary moments, but which wrap you up in love. The family stories that are passed down, which make you proud of your ancestors.
و ئەف دانوستاندن و هەستێک بە گرێدان یعنی زوودە ژیانە خەڵکی دەهێنە و تێنە دەرباسکردن و پاراستن ڕیا هەر نەفشێکی و خەڵک هەموو دەدا ئەزارۆکت خوا چەند فۆرمێت جدا وەکە ئەسترانێت فلفلۆری و گەلک خەمگینی و خۆشی و هەر تشت لواندە پەیدا دەبێت و چیرۆک هەکە دایک زارۆکت خوارد بیژن کە جارنا ترسی دەهە لێ با ئەو ترسشی هاتیە گۆتن ژوانڕە دابیە دەرسەک ژوانڕە و بە خۆش دەبێ ژوانڕە هاتە گۆتن و حەزکرد و ئەف چیرۆکت هەکە هەر مالک دەدا ئەزارۆکت خوا دا هەر سەر بلند بمینن بە باب و کالت خوا.
Passing on the oral traditions and keeping everyday relationships going is a kind of work that families and communities do in everyday life. They renew and tend their connections and relationships all the time in their ways of behaving with each other, what they say and how they speak. It's very time consuming. Now, as an anthropologist, I'd say that it is a constant labour of cultural persistence, and it goes on all the time until an event like the Ferman comes and ruptures this pattern.
پاراستنە ئاوان یعنی ئەدەبیاتە دەفکی ئاجیرۆک و سترانە ژیانە خەڵکیە ڕۆژانە دێ وەکە بوویە بەشێکی طبیعی ژیانت وان و ژیانت وان بێ بانجیرۆک و سترانە دەرباس نابن و ئەف گەلک وەختیژت بە و بانجیرۆک و سترانە بدنە زارۆکت خوا و زارۆت خوا و ئەس ژی وەکە ئەنترۆپۆلۆگت ئەس ژێرت بێژم وەکە کارێکی یا خەباتەکە برخودانا چاندی بردوان. و افتشت بردوان دبي حتى فرمانك ني و يعني وان وجيانا خلقي الروجانجي يعني تعدلي بيكرن وفستران او والزحمة يارد الراسو.
Okay, so I have a few slides. Just to give you something to look at. Let's talk about this Ferman of 100 years ago and remind ourselves of the map. So obviously this is where Shingal is, but Armenia is here, and the Êzidis that went to Armenia were from Van and Kars and Bayazid. As Dr. Maria reminded us, the Êzidis of these areas were displaced by the Ferman. And after 1915, many of them stayed in Kars in Turkey because it was under Russian control. But after the Russian Revolution, the Ottomans took Kars, and Êzidis and Armenians together moved into what was then called Transcaucasia, which now we know as Georgia and Armenia.
كأم جارجدي بينا بيرا خب رياضي النخشة جهة إزديا الكدري بون بري فرمانا يعني بري 6 سالي چند إزديا جهة وان الكدري بون و يعني چونا كدري يعني بشتي فرمانا سالا 1915 تا 1918 بجوكا دكتور ماريا دينيا بيراما ازيد قارس وواني وبعزيده بشتي سال 1900 وبشتي فرمانه سال 1915 بري خدانا ابي يعني حريما كتي ناس كلن بقفقاسي كو امجرد بيجن جورجيا وارمينيا يعني جورجستان وارمنستان.
So the Ottoman army, these people were moving from Turkey into Armenia, and the Ottoman army pursued them. But here's Yerevan, you see, and a battle happened south of Yerevan called Sardarapat, where the Turks, that is the Ottomans, were defeated by the Armenians and the Êzidis together. But the Êzidis played a very special role in this because the battle was kind of here, south of Yerevan, but there's a very large mountain here, Mount Aragats, and they won this battle here, and then they heard that there was another detachment of the Turkish army coming around the mountain this way. So the Êzidis, a special detachment of Êzidis, came up and defeated the Turks the Ottomans at a place called Bash Aparan. And this heroism by the Êzidis is very well remembered in Armenia now.
وبجي لوي وقتی فرمان سال 2015 تا 2018 بجي او ازدی بر ارمنستان چویین يعني حكومتها يا جيش عثماني كت دوان يعني دوان كت دا يكي جوان نهيلن وإزدياجي يعني البرخدان و بجي الشرق لدلو دورد إيريبان شيبو بتايبت لباشور إيريبان وجرد بيجن شر سردرابات و ازدیا يعني رولك قالكي امازن شركي مازن وركرن كل برخدان و بجي وقت وان برخد دا وان و ارمنيا بجي رتلك ديجه جيش عثمانيا البشتوي جاي اغسون رهات كو الويدريجي إيزديا وأرمينيا برخدا و من خاصية كجلكي أمازن خويا كرن و كوختانها لأرمنستان لبيرا خلقتي.
So in that Ferman, many people were killed, but also many were scattered and didn't find their relations, their families for many years. And when we talk about the orphanage generation, we mean those young Êzidis who grew up in orphanages because their families were lost. And there were some very famous intellectuals.
وبيجي بشتي يعني الوي فرمانه ده قالك ازدي هاتنا كشتن قالك خلق هاتا كشتن وقالك خلق بلابون قالك خلق وندابون وقالك زار واجي داقو باوز خوا ومالد خوا ونداكرن او زاروت سيوي لسيوي كهادا مازن بون جبر مالد وان وندابون وجوان سيويد ازدي اید که جوی فرمان خلاص بوین چند ویسکاری ابنابو دنگنها وکا حجیه جندی و امین عبدال و جاسم جلیل و قناة کردو و جردوی یگنجو.
I need to catch you up.
Sorry.
I know that our oral historians know who these are. Hajia Jindi, folklorist and novelist, Jasim Jalil, also a folklorist and a writer, and Amine Abdal too, did a lot of folklore work. We can also talk about Jerdoe Genjo, and not so much Qanate Kurdo because he didn't grow up in an orphanage, but he is part of that generation.
بجي سرقو قناة كردون نا لسيوي هذا مازن بو بوانرا لبا أوجي يكا جوين نفشي نفسكارا كو قلق كار لسر باراستنا شان ديكرين.
And we must mention Zainaba Ivo, who was the first female speaker on Radio Yerevan's Kermanji program.
ولازم أمش بيرنكن أم زينبا إيفو جيبي نبيل أخوة كو يعني كساء هره كمبو كل سر راديو يرباني بكل مانجي أخفت.
These people are a little bit younger than Ereb Shemo, who's very famous for writing the first Kermanji novel, and he was a young adult when the Ferman happened, but they were children.
وأف نویسکار بهناكي يعني بشان سالار جه عربي شامو بجكتر بون وي وقتی عربي شامو كو أوجي يعني نویسکاره که بنابو دنگه و رومانا كرمانجي هربرين نویسی وي وقتی عربي شامو يعني خوردكي نوهاتي بو كو بسر خواهات بو يعني يمازن بو وقتی يوي فرمانه جينش.
All of them, except Qanate Kurdo, learned to read and write in the orphanage. That's really important. And they used the opportunities that the Soviet Union gave them, taking part in the literacy campaigns of the 1920s and developing a written literature in their own dialect of Kermanji.
بجي أفخلق كما بحث كلي إيرو يعني أف نفشي إن بيسكارا همو لسويجه هذا هيني خواندني ونويسيني بون و كو يعني يكاديا السوفيت يعني جغيني قناة كردو كو يكاديا السوفيت شانسك داوان درفتك داوان كو خواندني ونویساندنی بزمانی خوبکن کرمانجی و ادبکی خوی کرمانجی نویسکی لوی داره چه بکن.
The Soviet Union's nationalities policies included appointing young cadres to the lower echelons, young cadres from the nationalities to the lower echelons of government service. And Kermanji was taught in schools. You've probably heard of the Kermanji language theatre, and the newspaper Riataze.
و یەکەتیا سۆڤێت چەند ینی سیاسەتێت ئێدناشنالی ئەو کردن و ینی گێنجا ji her miletekî bikine hikûmeta xwe de û ینی کادری حکومتا خود و کرمانجی جی لناف وان دبو و یعنی گرته یعنی و بهیست بیجی کرمانجی وکا شانوب کرمانجی هبو و یعنی روشنامه جی هبون وکا ریاتازه.
Some of the orphanage generation collected oral traditions from the Kurmanji-speaking communities, and as writers themselves, they made great use of their own oral traditions in their own writing. As Dr. Esther was saying last week, these are ways of preserving oral traditions in new forms.
چند جوان نویسکارا زانینا خویال سر ادبیات دفکی ملت خوجیره لنویساندنا خود بکار آنین و وکا دکتور استر شپید گوتی هفتیاوری افجی ریکن نونه اش پارستنا ادبیات دفکیر.
Of course, the orphanage generation are no longer alive, but I've interviewed some of the next generation of Soviet intellectuals, the generation of Professor Jalila Jalil. And without exception, they emphasize the importance of the oral tradition in their development as artists and scholars of heritage.
و بێگومان ژبەرگو یەکشبان بێت کەم بەست کەن یەکی ساغ نەمایە منگاری ام خوب گهین وان و هف بیبینا وان را چه بکن لبا او نفشه لدو وان رهادی و کار لدو وان را بردوام کری وکا جلیل وکا پروفیسور جلیل و نفشه وی کو چند نویسکار دیجی بون وان کار السر یعنی هر کار خوب بردوام کرد السر پاراستنا به چاندی و وان ادبیات دفکی بریا کار اکادمی و پروژه شخصی.
They didn't mention written literature or scholarship as an influence, but the actual stories that their parents and grandparents told them. One writer, Karlen Chachani, said to me, "All the intellectuals came from villages. Our university was our parents, our grandparents, our community." Through their academic collections, novels and poetry, these writers were able to preserve their heritage.
ودجاكيم يعني يا بحثا أدبي إنويسكي نتكلم إيكوان خواندي وباندورا وي لسن بيساندنا وانشان شبو لباقالا أباندورا تشيروك وستران وأدبيات الدفكي إد بابو قالت خوا ودابير وبابير خوا أذكرن باندورا وان لسن بيسينا وان ونویسکارێکی یعنی بنابێ کارلێنێ چاچان کریستین پیژێشمەرە گوت کو هەموو ئینتەلێکچوال یا مثقف ئێزی ژە گوندا هاتن و یعنی زانینگەهامەیە یەکەم دا باب و داگ و بابیر و داپیرد ما و جواکا ما و بریا کلکسیونت خود اکادمی و رومانت خوا و شعر خوا وان نویسکارا که شوپیا خوا و چاندا خوا برای نو پرست.
But Dr. Maria 3 weeks ago, was telling us about other stories from the past of the Armenia Êzidis, the ones that couldn't be written down. And these were the women's memories of the Ferman, of witnessing violence and losing parents and children, which were also carefully preserved and passed down, but in families.
بجي بريشن هفتي ديسا ماري دكتور ماريا سكسون بالكن قالت تشتكيش مركر كوتشاوا تشيروكيل سر جيانا بري از ارمينيا ارمنستان تهاتن يعني هاراستن وتشاوان دنفيساندن ودتانا النفشيت نو اتزاروكت ازديا بجي چند جوان يعني بيرانين جنابون السر فرمانيرا والسر ديتنا دعداي والسر يعني جدست دانا زاروك وداكو بابت خوا وچاوا حتى نهجي يعني افتشت پاراستن ودانا مال بعد تدخل.
When the Shingal Ferman happened, there was a strong feeling among Armenia's Êzidis that their own genocide should also be part of public knowledge. And the knowledge was still there in the families because of all this work of memory that had been done, telling and listening to the past and feeling the emotions that the traditions carried. A lot of this knowledge isn't just carried by the words, but is carried in the feelings that people experience in their bodies. And it's not only the orphanage generation of intellectuals, but the entire community that participated in this work.
وقتی فرمانا ازدیاد 1014 چه بوی رودای الشنغالی بجه چند ازد ارمنستان جی رابون سرپا وگودن لازم خلق زانه بیلسر فرمانا مجیره آقا بری چند ساله هاتی وفنا جارا بری وددویه وسا فرمان دينا أسري إزديا ورابونا سرخوا دا أوجي فرمان أخوا بخلقي بدنا ناسكر وحتانوها أوزانين وبيرانين لناف يعني مع البعض دوان دا معبون وقهشتونا النفشي إدنو إش خلقي إزدي أمرستان وبريا أبيف وشيروكت ادخلكي وهر وكون بيجن سربورت ادوان اتلاكشيج ونبتني بريا نفشي نفشي السيوية نفشي السيوية هال متقفة إزدي لبريا أخلقي هموكي أفكار هذا كده.
So perhaps we can say after the Shingal Ferman that memory is too important a job to be left to the intellectuals and that as many people as possible need to be involved. This is one reason why Shingal Lives aims to share as much as possible of the indigenous knowledge that it collects within the Shingali community.
جا دیم باشم بینه یعنی مقارن بیجن بشتی فرمانا 1014 افسر ازدیاد هات شنگال او یعنی کاری بیره و بیرانینه با کارکی باشکدی یعنی ودوی یعنی دیسا مرو لیوگرگه کو چنده گرنگه اشخالگیره دا خوب پاریزنده بیرد خوب و اب یکشواند سدمی حکمه دست به شنگال لیفسکری دا ام زانینا خلقی اخوجی بدنا پیش لناف خلق شنگالی.
I talked before about social connections, which for Êzidis are quite complicated and which build identity through constant interaction. In Soviet Armenia, the intellectuals were not so bothered about the Saduhat, and some of them married outside, but most Êzidis still kept many of the traditional social relationships.
جنبري بهناكي قالا دانستاندن و گردان جواکی کرنا في ازدیادك و قالك يجي بزحمت نش هر كسي ركو تمامي فين بك والتبلي هبن وكا مجار ناوي ازداد أرمينيا ده يعني intellectual دوان ثقافة دوان نقل يجي دعاجز بونجبان حد وسد يتحكى لنابوان دهي لباوان هيج بخور هيلان أفتشت من أفخذ هيلان.
And even though life in the Soviet Union was extremely hard, great poverty, deportations, political violence, other kinds of violence, social injustice, families remained close. It was only after the end of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s that economic collapse and wild capitalism, as people called it, forced many people to move far from their families.
والجسري يعني ويزل موزور داري بلنغازي وأواقل الجيانا أخل كده يكاد سوفيتا بريدة هر مال ومال بعد ما نيزيكي كدو لبابتني بشتي كتنا يكاد سوفيتي والتايبت السالة نودا بيشا سالة نودا بشتي و تنغافيا ايكونومي اقتصادي و خلق جيرد بيجي كابيتاليزم وحشي خلق سوفيتا دركت وبربجي ديشو ومال جيك دور كده.
Dr. Hana Usoyan's book, Dr. Hana Omar Khali, her book Êzidism from Deep Millennia, it's called, describes Êzidis working in Siberia, Russia, and Eastern Europe, all sending money back to family in Armenia. And as Dr. Maria told us, villages in Armenia in general are emptying. And it's this dispersal, this scattering, which makes Êzidis from Armenia really worried about loss of identity, really concerned that those memories of Ferman and other things will be forgotten.
وبجواك دكتور خانة عمر خالي الكتاب أخوال سر إزديادش مرد بجي تشاوا إزديال سيبيريا وروسيا و روشلاتا أوروبا کار دکرن و درابج مالت خورد شاندن لأرمينيا لأرمنستان و وقت دكتور ماريا سيكسوهن بالكنجي قوتما يعني خلقي ازدي كيم لقوندت خويد أرمنستان دمايا و بلابونا وان السر روي دنياي بويا السببك اشقلقا مرة واشترسا مرة السر يعني بجدس دانا الناس ناميخو.
So, in conclusion, I'll say I think that there are two important lessons to be learned here about cultural survival. One is that after a Ferman, we may get a strong reaction of people wanting to revive and repair their heritage. Even in Armenia, the Shingal Ferman has prompted a huge outpouring of feelings among Êzidis. And in Iraq, last week, Dr. Esther explained how the lighting of lamps at Lalish is one of a number of traditions that has actually got stronger since the Shingal genocide.
وبجي التعليرة أمكارن ديسا يعني هي درس جرينج ببن إج يعني إيش خلاص بون يعني إيش نجات بونا عشاندي بشتي فرمانكي يك جوان كو بشتي فرمانه يعني رياكسيونك رد فعلك مزن ويش آلية خلقي بتشيبه كو چند أخوة دیسا ساخ بهیلن یا وژین یا هر بپارزن و حتی الأرمينيا جي وقت فرمانه ازدال شنگالی رودای چند حول چه بون کو دیسا يعني گریدان خواه به خلق ازدی اجدر بیم ای أرميني و العراق جيوكا دكتور إسر جمارة قوتي حفتيا بوري يكجي ريو رسمت البري هذا أنو قرن لنافي ازديادة أو جرا بخستني إلا لشكو سال بسال خلق زيدتر ديد.
We see this revival with the orphanage generation 100 years ago, again using technologies that were new for them, doing this work of preservation. And we see this now with our young team of oral historians at Shingal Lives, absorbing the traditions themselves and using our new technologies and working to share the experience of the oral traditions with others. We often say in the team that they remind us of the orphanage generation.
وكمل الفجاندنا چاندا ازدي بقرين يعني أبري فسد سالي أكا نفشي إسيويا يعني دست بكري بشان تكنولوجيا هكا قالك أنو بجوان وان كار آني دا چاندا خوبي بپارزن نوها أبي تشتي التيم أخويا شنگال لیوز جدید بیل کو همو خمخورد چاندا ازدینا و وان تکنولوژیت نو کار دیلن دا يعني ادبیات خوا و دیروک خوا دفکی شیوازید باشتر و هزدارتر بپارزن و يعني قالك جارت بيجن كو اب تيما ماشن قال لبس وكارما التوتو ما يعني وي نفشي يسويا البيرامتين.
The other big lesson for me from the Armenia Êzidis is the importance of Êzidi community. The culture survived 70 years of very hard Soviet rule, but the community stayed together. But the heritage is more fragmented now because people are separated.
بجي آديجي درس آديجي أكم كارنجي هين ببن شاوا يعني هفتي سالي بشتي فرمانه اف في جواكي خو بيگر و چند خو پاراستن و تنی وقتی اوجیک قد بوین پاراستنا چنده لنوانده کیم بو و بزحمت در بو.
I think that separation is the biggest danger for cultural survival. But I also think that the Êzidi tradition of cultural persistence is extremely strong, and although some changes are inevitable, preserving the heritage will continue to be an important part of the Êzidi struggle. Thank you very much for listening.
از بخواد بینم يعني شهف قدبون وبلعبون جواكي يعني مدرسيا هرا مزنتريا السر خلاص بون يا بارستنا عشاندكي لديجي اس ويتشتديجي تيم بيشاوت خو شاوا ازديا يعني اواكي هزدار النيف خودم خو بيك بگرتن بان هر يعني سر چند فرمان او چند ساله و فولکلور و ادبیات خود دفکی و دیرو که خود دفکی پاراستن حتی روژا بیرو سری همو زحمتی و زوداری بیجه مالا و همو که آبا برو گفتاری هم اگر.
Well, Christine, thank you for such a balanced talk that really looked realistically about the threats that the community faces to the preservation of its culture, but also the tremendous strength, and not just on an abstract level, but very specific strength the community has for resisting. As you said, I love that daily labor image of culture being in daily labor. So thank you for that. We've had questions pouring in throughout the talk. I wondered if I could sneak in a quick question here off of your final thought. You mentioned chronic displacement and the scattering of families or contiguous social groups as much of a threat as the acute event of genocide. I wondered what differences you see in how Yazidis confront these two distinct threats, which are obviously related. Usually one follows the other, but I wondered what differences you saw in how Yazidis confront those different threats.
That's a very good question. I do think that the violence inspires a lot of resistance and persistence. And, you know, we've seen that with numerous Farman, but particularly, I'm sort of coming to Dalia's question, why this, I think it was Dalia who asked the question about why this one. But this one is very well documented, and it really shows that I think that wherever they are, Êzidis will use whatever they have at their disposal, and they had some very useful things in the Soviet Union, like the literacy campaigns and the ability to write. I must admit that part of my thought about this displacement business is also got from looking at other small religious communities and what's happened. And I think that if people go outside the homeland completely and they're far from their own, from very many of their own people, then the biggest danger becomes marrying out. And we've seen that with the Mandaeans, with the Zoroastrians. You know, a lot of small closed groups have this issue. So that's why it's not I'm cheating a bit, because it's not only looking at this example, but it's true that in the Soviet Union, it was when people got very scattered that there started to be more fears for cultural fragmentation. Yeah.
بجي أف وكميناك أستين مش بر أفميناك باش هات يا دوكيمنت كرن إيش عالية خلقية وبجي لي أفتشت راس دجي هكا ابتني مدرسي سر پاراستنا آچان دیچه وقتی خلق جیا گودو قد بوی جی حتی اول دورا گودوون نه بلنگازیه و نه تشتکی نه ظلمکی و نه زورداریکی نه گرگو پاراستنا شان دل نیوانده کم بی او در بدر بون و کوچ بر بون و جهف قد بون و يعني تعديها هرم مزن لچاندا ازدیگ يعني لچاندا أبي جباكيكل وبيجي از بريد شتيت فكرم إجبر ما كار لسر هناك جباكي ديجي كريا وكا جباكي تصابي ايد مندائي كو وانجي چاندا خو پاراست حتى جي يكودو قد نبو وبر ولات الديدار نكد.
And on the back of that question, Christine, Shahab had a question about why you thought it was difficult to articulate where religion stops and culture starts in practical religions like the Êzidi religion. And I also wondered if you might speak a little bit more about the distinction you made between insiders and outsiders on precisely that question that Shahab asked. I was really interested in the question of position. and also in your whatever answer you'll offer to Shahab's question of those sort of borders or boundaries within the Êzidi community between culture and religion.
Well, up to now, the distinction between an insider and an outsider is quite clear for Êzidis, because, you know, if somebody doesn't have two Êzidi parents, they will say, oh, they're not a Êzidi, usually. There aren't very many borderline people yet. But with regard to Shahab's question, I've always found it difficult because, for example, if you think about, there are some stran that only Êzidis sing and that Êzidis enjoy and derive special meaning from. So they're definitely Êzidi culture, but they're not about Êzidi holy beings. They're not about the Khas or the saints or anybody like that, and they're not about, you know, religious matters. But they're still specifically Êzidi. So I suppose that's what I mean by saying that there is this larger culture, but it can be difficult to identify because, you know, some of the everyday socializing, you know, might be conditioned by Êzidi ways of behaving, but they're not necessarily talking about religion, say, or they're not necessarily talking to a sheikh. Do you see what I mean? There's a repertoire of specifically Êzidi cultural practices that are not necessarily about religious practice. But on the other hand, we know that Êzidism is a religion that says you should do this, you shouldn't do that, and they're all very practical things about what you should eat and where you should go, and, you know, ways that you should behave. So it's a bit of a puzzle, really, for me to say, oh, that's religious and that's just cultural, you know. And I sort of think maybe only a Êzidi could say that. But I am quite heartened because I heard a senior professor of theology on the radio recently saying that nobody really knows how to define what religion is these days, because all the things you can say about religion, you could also say about football. So I'm not alone in being a bit confused about the difference between religion and culture.
بجي يعني سري به خواندنا منه و يعني لكل وكلنا من السر ازديار جهيش از زحمت يل به تایبت من ديال بين به يعني جدا کرنے دت بینم چاندی اش اولل نبي ازدياد بجي راستا قالك تشتهي كنب اولي بگریدا وكستران وچيروك وافتشت ايكا خلقي ازدي خوشيا خوشيد بينن وند اولينا يعني اتشاندينا لبا وچاوا خلق تيكليو دانو ستاندنتكا لبا بجي زانين وتعاليم اولا ازديجي يعني باندورا خوا السر سلوك الخلقي هنا وچاوا يعني دانو ستاندني بخلقي ديرا بكن وچاوا هر بي كاري پاراستنج بكن همو يعني اول لسر بان همو تشتاجي را تبايبي.
Christine, we had a couple of questions about modernization and the impact of modernization on the question that Shahab has was the impact of modernization. I'm sorry, the impact of genocide on modernization trends in the Yazidi community. So how has the disruption of genocide pushed Yazidis into certain modernizations? I also wondered, on the flip side, how has modernization, globalization been disruptive to culture? I was wondering both ways.
Well, to answer the second part first, in folklore studies, people usually say that modern technology is bad for folklore because people would rather, you know, watch television than listen to Stran. And indeed, we know that our own dear Mamusta Zedan used to feel like that. but now, of course, yeah, modernization can be a boon to things like oral tradition. I think that the genocide, we have a student, well, we have a PhD researcher at Exeter who's completing a PhD on changes in women's lives and women's role and agency since the genocide. And he's spoken to quite a lot of women who say things like they felt that Shingal was very remote and that they have better education and employment opportunities and where you're living in Kurdistan. So there are some people that feel that they have advantages that they didn't have before because of the changes that have taken place. So I think that there have been, you know, perhaps changes in youth culture as well. And I'm not sure how many, perhaps Mr. Zeydan knows, I'm not sure how many young Êzidis went into higher education before the genocide, but I have the impression now that the younger generation in general is very keen to get as much education as possible. So I do think that, you know, this terrible thing that's happened has made people more determined to advance in the modern world, to put it in a slightly old-fashioned way.
بجي بيقومان يعني شهردو آليابا وكا نوجن كرني modernization و وكا globalization يا أولمي يعني بريد سلبي وإيجابي باندورا خوا سرجانت خلقية هينة يك جوان كو بيبام هذا بيري كو شاوا يعني تلفزيون ندهي لا أم قهدار يا أفلكلوري خوبك بجي البان ريكا يعني تعديق للفلكلور وبارستنا فلكلور وأدبيات التفكير بالله خلقي ده ليش آلية دي جيبا وكا نوجن كرنو أو قالك درفت أشخال كيرا شيد كدرفت كار شيد كدرفت زانين بشي وازد مو شيد كأشخال كيرا دا هر يعني هر چند خوشی بشي وازد باشد بجاجبان هر دو آلیا با باندورا خوا هر آواید ایجابی و سلبی هر دو آل.
Wonderful. Thank you, Christine. Thank you, Zeydan, again for all of this translation. We've had another question come in from the Zoom attendees, from Amir Sharifi, who asks how the relations are between Yazidis and Armenians in Armenia after the latest genocide, how the so-called border relations are between the two, especially in films such as Vodka Lemon, is the specific inquiry from Mr. Sharifi. And you're muted, Christine.
Yes, sorry, there was a lot of noise at my end. I am a little out of touch with Armenia, which is one reason why I'm speaking about the about history. I think that Dr. Maria would be better placed to answer this question. But traditionally, relations have been very close and very good. They fought together in the First World War. And the Karabakh conflict has, as you probably know, exacerbated tensions between Kurdish speakers who are Muslim and the Êzidis in Armenia. And the Êzidis in Armenia stayed, and most of the Muslim Kurmanji speakers did leave because they were identified, you know, they were identified as Muslims with Turks and Azeris as well. And so that has been a very difficult tension. But certainly before the genocide, there were close and good relations, and some Yazidis wanted to stick to older kinds of identity and the Soviet identity, which was to say that they were Kurds as well, but Kurds of Êzidi religion, and others wanted to go with the Armenians and say, because this is what the Armenians said as well, and say that they were a separate ethnic group. And I think obviously after the genocide, that's become more general. But in general, I think that we hear fewer talks, fewer accounts of human rights abuses of Êzidis in Armenia than we do in Georgia and other places in the former Soviet Union. So it's a bit of a rambly answer.
بجي برسيارك كريستين هاتي كرن سر دانوس اندرن ليبا ازيا ارمينيا د بريو بشتي جينوسايد بجي كريستين بجي تايبد وقت ديرو بشمارت بجي ازدي و ارمني بونا بشتك لوي فرماني و تيكلين ليبوان قالك يجيد باش بون شوي ويدمي وهتانو هذا وقت زاني نعمة وبيجي يعني هناك تشتيبون حاجة كان يعني عم ببين إن شاء يعني دانوس نادنا نبا إزديا أرمينيا باش بوكا شاوا أرمينيا كردي بسلمان البر يعني برنا الريزا تركيا وأزريا وشاوا إزدي برنا الريزا خو مثلا جبر حكا هردو بشتك بون وما في دوان داني وكا يعني أولك لأرض أرمينيا ده وبجي في شري أرتساخ يعني قالك شوان تشتاقان نبيرا ما جارك دي شاوا أو هر وكا ملتك يش بشتك بدوك ده.
It's probably worth saying that I think that Dr. Maria's recent article about Êzidis in Armenia talks about how numbers have declined, but certainly they have after the end of the Soviet Union, and I think up to now, though I'm not 100% sure, they were the largest minority in Armenia. Armenia is quite ethnically homogeneous, unlike, say, Georgia, that has a lot of different communities. And the Êzidis were the most numerous minority throughout the 2000s.
وبيجي دكتور ماريا سلكسيون باهل كنجي يعني بيجي في اللي كيش شكو تعرض خوي داويدة بحث ك تشاوا إزدي مثلا الأرمينيا كيمت بنو كيمت بن الأرمنستان و يعني البان صالت داويدة بشت كتنا السوفيت أبري لي إزدي هر وكا اعتراف بيتاكل وكا بيك هاتك إش أرمينيا و أرمينيا جيجالك يعني تنوع كتيدها يعني عكسي جورجيا كا وسا تنوع كمازن بجد تيدا ترنه.
Christine, I just want to thank you again for such a wonderful talk, looking at the implications and using that word very neutrally and very inquisitively, so that you're looking at the implications of genocide and displacement with as full a gaze as possible. I think it's very exciting, the work that's coming out of that, and I'm really interested in the comparative aspects of this too that you brought up from other communities you've been working with.
If you don't mind me sort of interrupting, I don't want people to feel that I don't appreciate the seriousness of the genocide. I'm talking about cultural preservation, not about things like psychological trauma, which of course is extremely difficult to quantify, you know, and that's something that's affected everybody. Yeah.
I was thinking that. Go ahead, Zaidan.
جبتني من دستش لكي مثلا خلقي را زلالتر بكم بجي از السر مجارك شاندي كاردكم او جي پارستنا شاندي از نال سر مجارك سايكولوجي كاردكم او تشاوا يعني تراما او جينوسايد گشت خلقي.
I was just about to add that Dilshad asked, one of our oral historians asked, that part of his personal experience is actually that older people around him have not wanted to talk with him about these traditions, and he's been worried about that. I sense a little frustration and desire in him to hear that, and I actually thought to myself that a genocide, yes, people are coming off wanting to revive and repair, but also that reparation is happening deep in each person's psyche, deep in the communal psyche. And Christine, as you said, can deeply affect, of course, they want their children to inherit their cultural identity, but also they know that cultural identity will mark them for persecution. And that's a very difficult burden for the older generations to bear. So there's a lot of hope here that you're describing. But yes, all of us take the generational implications of trauma very seriously.
وما يجي بشيء دلشات الفيديو دلشات إذا كو برسيارك مثلا كوت ندي مش مثلا عالية كيم بونا قهتارة بجانا يعني مزناجي ندياج صار وتخرياش ياش نبيت خرب بيجن ومارد بيجي أوجي يعني عالية كدي إيش تشتيت بشتي كونفليكتا يا بشتي نزاع وهناك يعني تخوازن چند خب بپارزن اللي هناك بآوائی که دیجی تفکرن بیجن حکا اف چند وی هر تعدیه مثلا بش زارود مرة اینی وش باقا مرة چما امي تعديدنا زارو جباكا خو يعني اف برسياجي الباقا لك خلق الشيء.
So Christine, I'll just thank you again for all of your precision and delicacy and attention in this subject, and then let you step back into the role of a co-host of this series.
Yes, next week will be our final seminar in the series, and we'll be welcoming another very strong, very thoughtful and assiduous scholar, like the scholars that we've heard in previous weeks. And this is Dr. Estelle Ami de la Bretèque, who comes from France, and she has done a lot of research with Êzidis in Armenia. She's an ethnomusicologist, and she'll be discussing making Êzidi heroes in Armenia, from funeral songs to MP3.
وحفتيا بيجي مجارك دي وبين و قهداريا مهبانك نوكن مهبانا ما نو حفتيا بي دكتور استيل امي دي لا بروتيك وش فرنسا مرة بش باريس وكوه قطاركي پیشکش بك نابي افراندنا لهنگ ازدی لأرمنستان جه آواك غريبي حتى MP3 هون همو بمين الخير وخوشيه ده حتى وهنگ.
Fantastic. Can't wait. Thank you all for joining us this week, and we'll see you next week for our last session.
Thank you, everyone.